You know, I've really enjoyed this little resurgence that's been going on recently with space exploration films. I'm not really sure how or why this has come about now, given that we still seem very much far away from actually going anywhere anytime soon in the real world, but as a science fiction fan, I've really enjoyed the varying degrees to which each notable space movie in the past couple years or so has gone in its own separate direction. Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity leaned more towards thrilling disaster survival, Christopher Nolan's Interstellar leaned more towards sci-fi fantasy and string theory, and now in 2015 comes an adaptation of the famous novel by Andy Weir, The Martian, a story about a NASA botanist that winds up stranded on Mars and has to figure out a way to get home, that seems to focus most of its efforts on scientifically sound problem solving, and regardless of what you or I may critically think of these films individually, it's incredibly refreshing and encouraging to see such similarly themed movies pursue such contrasting genres and ideas of the kind of story you can tell with science fiction. That's pretty cool. An adaptation of The Martian has been in development for some time. At one point, Drew Goddard, who wrote the script, was set to direct, but that chair ultimately went to none other than Ridley Scott. Ah, Ridley Scott. It wasn't too long ago that you would have found me criticising the latest of his work. Given he redefined his image with sci-fi classics such as Alien and Blade Runner, it's been a sad experience, for me at least, watching such a cinematic mastermind maintain the visual artistry that informed the best of his work back in the day, and yet somehow simultaneously grow less and less involved in the whole narrative and character essentials of storytelling. It's one thing to successfully make up a film of well-composed shots on screen and build vast, tangible worlds, but if there's no heart at the core beyond what the eye can see, your flick is revealed to be more of a one-trick pony. And I'm not sure if it's the story that's already been written for them, Drew Goddard's adapted screenplay, or the fact that the material is, tonally, in and of itself a more light-hearted kind of tale than we tend to see from this filmmaker, but whatever the secret ingredient is, brings a sense of energy and passion back into Ridley's world that I can't recall seeing in recent memory. Case in point, The Martian is pretty darn great. A wonderfully optimistic space drama well versed in science with the narrative personality and charm to deem it Scott's best and most surprising movie in quite some time. This really doesn't feel like a Ridley Scott movie, at least not present day Scott. I'm sure it comes down to the script already having been written by the time he hopped on board later in the game, but still, it's really nice to have a science fiction movie look this amazing. The scenery and shots are masterfully composed, the stuff on Mars is a great mix of on-location shooting and CG effects, and the set design is realistic yet sleek, but to also have a good story here with humour, wit, levity, and colourful characters? Yeah, this is what happens when someone gives a shit about the screenplay. Thanks Goddard and Weir. Our story follows a team of scientists on Mars and astronaut Mark Watney, who after an accident during an intense storm leaves his crew to think he's been killed, and which encourages them to leave him behind when they return to Earth, awakens to find himself injured and left for dead. And not long after returning to the base, repairing his wounds, and realizing it's going to take at least 3 years before the next manned mission to Mars can reach him, he quickly begins using his unique set of skills to grow food in the artificial environment of the base and attempt to somehow make contact with Earth. It doesn't take too long for NASA to soon learn of his situation, and with both sides beginning to work hard to establish good working communication, a plan is quickly put forward to send a retrieval team before Mark runs out of luck. So yeah, we're gonna watch Matt Damon use his intellect and ingenuity to make the best of a bad situation, with his pastime only being reruns of Happy Days and Jessica Chastain's library of disco music, while continuously cutting back to NASA and the crew on their way back to Earth trying to figure out a way to save him. This film is really entertaining. I loved watching The Martian. I've grown more aware of runtimes lately, and this might be the first movie in months that is technically long yet doesn't feel it. I was engrossed in this start to finish, and while the jokes and one-liners spouted by Damon might have seemed a bit too excessive in the trailers, it's much more appropriately timed and spread out in the film itself. I'm not sure if the idea of having Mark document a series of video logs to maintain morale was in the novel before, or if it's something that's been added to the screenplay after the fact, but it's a great storytelling device for Damon to act off of and keeps the audience informed of his inner thoughts and workings. And if you're paying close attention and you start to think to yourself that the stakes don't genuinely seem all that high at one key moment, the film seems to agree with you, and it doesn't take too long for things to start happening to up the ante. I'll admit I'm not one of those guys that particularly cares all that much how accurate the science is, since you've intentionally sat down to watch a movie about science fiction, but if that attention to detail is respectful, educates a little, and helps establish a more realistic future for the material, make it so. It goes without saying, but Damon really does great here. I don't think anyone's ever really had an issue with him, we all just seem to like him. It's like the opposite of James Franco, but that wouldn't be the case if we didn't have a reason to. The man has a lot of range, and it's nice to see him dip his toes into the more charismatic, upbeat protagonist. Other standouts involve Jeff Daniels, who finds a good balance between genuinely wanting to help Mark and having to keep aware of the business side of things. Chiwetel Ejiofor makes for a likeable NASA engineer that helps establish contact, and the Mars crew led by Jessica Chastain, involving Sabastian Stan and Kate Mara to name a few, all share good chemistry, and while I would have liked to see a little more of that team and their camaraderie, the film as it stands already juggles an awful lot of side characters. Donald Glover even comes in at one point, and despite undoubtedly being an ensemble piece, it thankfully never feels overly complicated or bogged down in desperately trying to give some of the bigger stars more screen time. And while the story, when taken at face value, is pretty simplistic, it's the details that make it resonate much more, like the witty dialogue between certain characters, the various ways in which Mark approaches his survival, or how part of saving him depends on a subtle, unlikely banding together of China and the US. This is a film about human beings working together, and each and every plot progression, if not triggered by technology screwing up, is triggered by characters proactively making choices and getting things done. One character at one point asks if Ejiofor believes in God, and it can't help but feel intentional, as if the following proceedings imply that as much as he believes in God, he'll walk away from these events believing in people all the same. If The Martian does have one notable flaw, it is a bit of a stretch just how unbelievably amazing this guy is. It makes for a nice view, sure, but it does feel as if perhaps there's a scene or two missing of Mark truly losing his marbles, revealing him to be a little more vulnerable at his core, Moon style. At times it feels like the filmmakers are shooting for a type of Tony Stark level of power fantasy in terms of his intelligence, and while that does have its pros, it does feel as if they've sacrificed a more layered character for the sake of playing things safe with a more mainstream audience. I understand that the masses like to project themselves as the amazing protagonist that can do anything, but if you've gone to the effort to make your tech and universe in general as scientifically sound as possible, your protagonist should really be no different. But again, it is still really refreshing to not have a protagonist wallowing in his own self-pity for 2 hours 20 minutes, and the movie's constant emphasis on ingenuity is a great calling card for younger audience members to get into this kind of work. And since I'm already here counteracting my own criticism, it does feel as if Mark never truly becoming emotionally compromised is intentional to the overall themes at play. If the technology screwing up at times does anything, it feels like an attempt of nature trying to pummel him into submission. But you know what? The man's willing to get shit done, and he'll fight the hurricane if he has to. While I would admit that I prefer my science fiction a little more morally challenging, to complain about that, again, would be to play against the movie's terms. The Martian's aims lie not within the ethically ambiguous, dour social commentary subgenre of sci-fi, but a more light-hearted, promising tale, encouraging space exploration, problem-solving and smart thinking, and its sincere sense of optimism at heart makes it a real pleasure to watch. When it almost feels as if every other flick in the genre focuses on pointing fingers at the human race and saying, "Shame on you," which has its place, don't get me wrong, here comes a more hopeful view of a tomorrow where the world just might set aside its differences and come together to achieve a common goal and walk away as winners. Because sometimes, if we band together and work hard enough, we can pull through anything. Now that's a future I wouldn't mind living in. Cheers for watching guys, and as always if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel.